Can I also acknowledge we sit on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here today. Like Sally said, I'm a Gungaloo man from central Queensland. My people come from a mission called Woorabinda. My mum was born there, my grandfather, we shifted there, walked 250 kilometres in the 1920s to establish the place. We do things in Queensland like move Aboriginal people around because we need to build things. In this case, they wanted to build a dam which would have flooded the old Taroom mission. But they never did it. It's like a similar story at Mapoon in the bauxite country of Cape York, where they shifted the Mapoon people to build a port, but never built that. So we seem to have that history in Queensland of doing those things, shifting Aboriginal people around to satisfy some need, some once sort of folly of building things, but we never quite get around to build it, but we still have Aboriginal people shifted everywhere. I'm lucky because Woorabinda, where my grandfather walked to, is my grandmother's country. So while there are a lot of people in Woorabinda that don't come from there, we're actually the traditional owners. So I'm lucky in that sense that I can work that out. I came into this job really not knowing what I was going to do. I was really worried about it because you've got to have a plan these days. You know, everyone's got to have a plan to do something. I didn't have one. And I got really worried about what I was going to do, to the point where Katie Kiss, who heads up the social justice team, had to ring me on a Sunday night to see if I was still in Sydney to start work the next day. But I found out fairly quickly it would have been absolutely arrogant of me to work into a job like this with a well-defined plan for the 5 years. It took me a long time travelling around Australia, talking and listening to people about what's happening. And I worked out fairly quickly, I really needed to, I couldn't pick an issue like housing or the criminal justice system, our over-incarceration, particularly of young people, particularly of women. Have a look at the stats around the incarceration of our women these days. It's soaring out of control. I couldn't pick one of those things and figure in 5 years it's going to be fixed, because I think what confronts us in the Aboriginal community is almost a nation-building exercise that will go across generations. So I decided to talk about relationships. Relationships so people who do work in those areas can get the job done. I framed it around 3 things. The relationship between Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and the rest of the community. That allows me to talk about 2 things that are close to my heart. Constitutional recognition, and I'll be at the workshop this afternoon, and racism. Now, racism, in my last job as CEO of the Cooperative Research Centre for Aboriginal Health, our first 2 scholars, Indigenous scholars, Yin Paradis and Gilbert Gallagher, did their thesis on racism. And we worked out that racism just isn't a factor in our health, it actually makes us sick. It actually makes the perpetrator sick. Ian Anderson, who's a great friend of mine and colleague, said to me, that's because anything that makes your heart beat faster will eventually kill you. It's no good for you. I did tell him there's a few things that make my heart beat faster that's really good. But we won't go into that today, or right now. But it does make us sick. So that allows me to do that. The other level of relationship is between government and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And I think it's the worst it's ever been. And I think you can trace it back to that event in 2007 in the Northern Territory, the Northern Territory intervention, where we imposed solutions on 73 of the most vulnerable communities. We suspended the Racial Discrimination Act for those 73 communities to allow them to do things like income management, to control their lives. Before the GST came along, the ATSIC Act and the Native Title Act was the most debated and amended pieces of legislation in Australia's history. Those debates went on for months, if not years. As an indictment of all governments, the opposition, the debate that implemented the legislation for the intervention took 5.5 hours. Added up, we did. That's across both houses of Parliament, included an inquiry, 5.5 hours to take rights away, a year of debate to give us something like ATSIC or the Native Title Act. And when you're an Aboriginal person, you sit down and look at those sort of things, you start wondering, what is it about us? And I think it'll be a stain on Australia's soul for a long time that we suspended the act that was developed to protect the most vulnerable in our community from things like racism, against 73 of the most vulnerable communities I know. And I think all politicians, Labor and the Coalition, I discount the Greens because people like Rachel Stewart fought long and hard, but basically being a lone voice never had any effect at all. So there we go, because of this relationship with government, it's just wrong, and we've got to get it right. The last level of relationship is between Aboriginal people ourselves. We all wear scars from the politics in Aboriginal affairs. If you think it's hard in the Labor Party, come and sit in my chair for a while. We take on, I talk about the concept of lateral violence, where people turn against each other. And lateral violence, harassment, bullying, gossiping, backstabbing, all of name calling, all of that stuff happens in every society, every organisation, every family, every workplace. It will happen. But it's particularly hard for oppressed people, because what we do is we take on the behaviours of the oppressors and we internalise oppression. And that's happening in our communities now as we speak. It's happening in my own family. You know, it was the government in this country who started defining who was Aboriginal and who wasn't. That song we just heard, Archie's song, that was about people who weren't quite Aboriginal enough, so they got taken away. The biggest insult we can have in the Aboriginal community that we give each other is a coconut. You're a coconut. Brown on the outside, white on the inside. So we've taken on those behaviours and we've really got to step up and fix it. I've got a couple of minutes, so I'm going to talk about how we can fix that. And so, I said in this job, my work will be guided by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. It's the most important document that we have to guide us. And not only does it guide us with our relationship with government and other third parties, but it also guides our internal relationships. Because we developed, between our office and the National Congress of Australia's First Peoples, 4 principles that come out of the Declaration. Self-determination. We have to have self-determination. If we're going to control things, if things are going to get better, it's going to have to be on our terms. We've got to own the solutions as well as owning problems. And I think we need to redefine self-determination, reframe it. And I talk about measuring self-determination by how the most vulnerable in a community are exercising it. How the most vulnerable, the women, the children, the elders, are being heard. Not the strongest. And that's what we've done in the past. I was saying to David Legg and Jill before I came down here this morning that it's almost the government's work like the prisons, find the biggest and baddest prisoner and get them to run the prison. And that's what's happened in Aboriginal affairs, and we've got to stop it. Our women and children and the elders have got to be heard. The second principle is the right to participate in decisions. That's a fundamental right we all have. The right to participate in decisions that affect our rights, underpinned by the concepts of good faith and the right to give or not to give our free, prior and informed consent. So we've got to be involved, and I'll fight to the death about our involvement on that. The third principle is one of protection for and respect for culture. It's the oldest living culture in the world. And I think elders from Mutijulu told me that they want, when we talked about the constitution out there, that they want people to understand we have a constitution, how they own. It's called our culture. It's not written down anywhere, but we live it. And we want people to understand it. We want all people in Australia to understand it. But not only understand it, we want them to share it. Because if you're going to live in this country, you've got to share in the Aboriginal culture. It's your culture, the elders tell me. So next time you see someone like Arnie Jones give a welcome to country, or a dance group get up, or you hear a ditch playing, I challenge you not to think about that as exotic people who've come to entertain us. Think about that as your culture on display there. It also comes out of this, the concept of cultural security and cultural safety. So it has a practical edge to it. And the final principle is one of non-discrimination. And what we're hoping to do here, government, is go and look at every piece of legislation in the country that discriminates against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and fix it. And there's plenty of it, let me tell you. So I'll finish by saying, you hear these arguments about we can't have a rights-based approach. We want practical reconciliation. Actually, I don't think you're ever going to get practical reconciliation or any form of reconciliation unless you do respect our rights. We need more rights, not less rights. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.